Hi, Michael.
Hi, Bob. Nice to
Hi.
see you.
Nice to see you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both audio podcasts and streaming video. You're Michael Shermer, probably well known to just about everyone who's tuning in, but in case there are a few who have been living in a cave, how do you like to introduce yourself?
Generally, publisher of Skeptic magazine, monthly columnist for Scientific American, and I'm an adjunct professor at Chapman University. I teach a class one day a week at Chapman in Orange called Skepticism 101. So obviously it's based on my work at Skeptic magazine.
All right. And why don't you plug a book or two while you're at it?
Well, my latest book is The Moral Arc, just out in paperback, about moral progress, one of our mutual interests.
And we, in fact, had a conversation. People can Google it. We have a video
right.
conversation on that book. Yeah.
Right, and my next book is called Heavens on Earth, The Search or the Quest for Immortality and Perfectibility. So I have to turn the manuscript in January, and it's about both religious and scientific attempts to achieve immortality, the afterlife, heaven, whatever. And the most interesting material is all these scientific attempts, the mind uploading, cryonics, radical life extension, the singularity, all that. And then the middle chapters on perfectibility, utopias and dystopias and ideas of progress and decline in civilization and all the different theories about that, another one of our mutual interests. And then my last chapter of that book is on purpose. So that's why your article in the New York Times got my attention. It's like, okay, that's right. Bob's into this purpose stuff. Let's see what he has to say. Because you've been writing about this for a long time. I reviewed your book, Nonzero, and I listened to your book, The Evolution of God, which was, I thought was quite good. And so, it's along those lines. I'm glad you're doing this because you're an atheist, or at least a non-believer.
An agnostic.
Agnostic.
And in a certain sense, I mean, because I do think that there's at least some evidence for the hypothesis that there is some larger purpose at work manifesting itself through the workings of nature. You might say I'm even closer to religious than the average agnostic, but you're right. I'm not, a theist.
Yeah. So, most of the people I deal with on this question of purpose are, take the theistic perspective, which doesn't really do us any good in terms of a scientific point of view. So, starting off with just your disclaimers in your latest piece that, you're not assuming there's any kind of supernatural or paranormal forces at work when you talk about purpose, then at least we're on the same page of, well, let's see how we can parse this in terms of just what we know about the universe.
Right. And in a certain sense, I mean, the piece, it got the predictable reply from Jerry Coyne, one of the more animated new atheists. And one thing I want to talk about before we're done, it is the kind of the new atheism, and because you're in an interesting position here. You are, to some extent, I would say, allied with the new atheists, but you're not one of the more fervent ones. And so I'm gonna ask you a little, if you can give us any insights into the interesting workings of the mind of Jerry Coyne. But we'll get to all of that because so I mean, I just thought when I read his kind of, I guess, predictable takedown of the piece, I thought, oh, well, I failed again. Because the interesting thing about this piece from my point of view was that although I have in the past mounted actual arguments that there is at least some evidence of some larger purpose at work, and in fact, this piece linked to such an argument, I didn't think of this piece as such an argument. This piece was trying to dispel misconceptions that I find always impede my successfully communicating my argument for purpose. So, for example, as you said, the idea, it must be something supernatural, must be spooky forces. So the piece was almost entirely devoted to that, to clarifying what purpose can mean. Why, on the one hand, it could be that yes, for all we know, some higher intelligence set things up. If indeed natural selection is working out some purpose, it could be that. But there's also other ways that natural selection could have been set in motion that I think would also qualify for the term purpose. So anyway, I was kind of, I almost meant the whole piece to be disclaimers, but it was taken in some corners as trying to do more than that. So,
well, pretty much anytime you write on these kinds of topics, somebody's not going to like it.
You've noticed that.
I don't mean just say theists, but people on our so-called our side, and that's part of the problem is that we have a side, and we're very tribal, and particularly on these sorts of things. And I think the feeling of the new atheists about people like yourself is that you might crack the door open just a little bit for the theistic argument to come swooping back in and make inroads into, say, public school science courses in the form of something like intelligent design. Even though that's not the argument you're making, it's closer than the argument I would make. So maybe that opens the door for someone like a Bill Dembski to then glom onto you as a champion of their side.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually wrote one of the initial rebuttals to intelligent design. I mean, like
Yes,
15 years ago in Slate.
I know you did.
And I thought it was pretty effective personally. But in any event, I mean, it's interesting you should say that because I was going to ask you, why do people get so upset? I mean, the way I was going to frame the question is, okay, I get it that they don't want creationists in the public schools. I see why an evangelical who wants to do that bothers them. I see why if they think that the root of Islamic extremism is in fact religious belief, which I don't think it is. But if they think that, I understand why they want to dispel belief in God and so on. But like when you have a philosophical hypothesis and you're trying to do like a considered appraisal of it and presentation of it, it's like, I was going to say why I don't get the animus, but I guess you're right. They think that somehow, the next stop is creationism in the public schools. But I would just say, I think the arguments that I encounter from somebody like Jerry Coyne in response to a piece like this is, in a sense, it represents exactly what they claim to be trying to dispel, which is a kind of irrationalism. It's kind of getting so caught up in what you want to be the case that you can't even just read what someone is saying clearly and respond to it calmly. But go ahead.
Well, yeah, that is part of the problem, of course, and I think it's that it's like you might be a gateway drug for people
Right.
to then try to slip in actual spooky forces at work, even if it's nothing really theistic that any believer would believe. It's a little bit like Sam Harris's argument about Muslim moderates enabling the extremists by acknowledging that the supernatural beliefs might be true, even though most Muslims would never act on those beliefs in any violent way. The fact that they're acknowledging that they too agree that those supernatural things are true, that enables the extremists to go one step further by saying, well, look, everybody believes this, we're just acting on it. So maybe it's something also along those lines. So I think it's good to tease apart the social activism, which the new atheist movement is largely about, versus just purely philosophical or scientific discussions about hypotheses. So you presented this as a hypothesis. Presumably, it could be testable, I suppose, in some manner.
Well, it's not readily testable, but I think because it's an historical argument. It's an argument about it's a question about how life arose, what set in motion natural selection. That you can't kind of do an experiment about that in a certain sense, but you can amass evidence for and against, and that's what I've tried to do.
Well, you remember back in the 90s with Gould's idea of the left wall of ultimate simplicity. You can't go any further left toward simplicity. The arc of life can only go toward more complex. So his reason to make that argument is that it's not that from simplicity to complexity is a trend. It can't get any simpler. So you got to go to the middle of the graph and then ask, is it more likely to go simpler or more complex? And that would be kind of a test you could do in the fossil record. And it cuts both ways. I mean, there's some species or genus or whole lineages that don't get any more complex. Like sharks are 400 million years old, and they're pretty much the way they've always been today versus 400 million years ago. There's no noticeable increase or trend in complexity in the shark genus. And that's actually true for most species. They don't really do much of anything. I think that was Gould's point about stasis is much more common, and therefore the punctuated rapid change through these bottleneck effects. These founder populations are very rare, so they don't appear in the fossil record, and that's punctuated equilibrium. That's a testable hypothesis, I think, along the lines of what you're proposing.
Yeah, but what I would say is, okay, so we're talking about the question of directionality in evolution. How likely was evolution to lead to a species as intelligent as us? And to me, the relationship of that to the question of purpose is not that if it was very likely to lead to intelligent life, then we know there was a purpose. It's just that if, to the extent that it looks like it was likely to lead to life, that is, evidence in favor of the hypothesis, or to put it the other way, it would certainly be evidence against the hypothesis if there were no tendency toward higher intelligence, right? So that's germane to the hypothesis. There can be evidence for or against, but I'm not saying that if you accept my argument, and the argument of people like Dan Dennett for that matter, the various people who've argued that there is that kind of directionality in evolution, I'm not saying that if you accept that, then the hypothesis of purpose is confirmed. It's just a little evidence in its favor. And by the way, Jerry Coyne, don't want to harp on him, but he says, Wright says, quote, that there's a purpose simply if a process is heading somewhere. He puts heading somewhere in quotes. I've never said that. I've always put it the way I just put it, and it's just one of like a number of things. And one reason I guess I feel compelled to recite some of the errors in his piece is I challenged him to debate me, and I would be overinterpreting if I said he was afraid to. Let's just say he said no. But so.
Well, I don't want to speak for him, but it might be that in some of your sentences you don't define terms like higher, or you use the word purpose. You use the word purpose differently in different paragraphs of those pieces.
Okay, we can talk about purpose, but I'd say two things. First of all, at the end of the Times piece, I say I have elsewhere argued that purpose is a hypothesis. You can have evidence, and I link to it. And if you and that lays things out in a way that I maybe will return to, but it's very much along the lines of what I just said. So I think it's reasonably clear, and I certainly in no point in the Times piece say something has purpose if it's heading somewhere. I said that what the direction I see in evolution is among the evidence I see for purpose.
Okay, so just say it again so I make sure I got it and the viewers get it. How do you define purpose?
Well, I actually didn't define it there. What I would say, if we're defining purpose, here's the way I would look at it. I would go to Richard Dawkins's very good book, The Blind Watchmaker. Okay, and he says, William Paley, of course, is theologian. He had this argument, in 17th century, I think, 18th. He said, William Paley said, look, you're walking across a field, you see a rock, doesn't look like it's designed for anything. You're walking across a field, you see a pocket watch. Well, obviously that was designed. And he says, okay, well, if you're walking across a field and you see like a squirrel or some animal, that's obviously divine. It's complex, it's functional, blah, 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 so there must be a God. Okay. And Richard Dawkins is admirably clear. What he says is, Paley was wrong about the God part, but Paley was right to distinguish between a rock and an animal and say that an animal requires some kind of special explanation for how it came to be. That's different because there is evident functionality. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So here's what.
But design and function might be different than purpose?
Well, it might be, and this is a question of nomenclature. Okay. So first of all, what he's saying is that there are kinds of properties that you see in a pocket watch, you see in man-made artifacts, and you see in animals that require some kind of special explanation. The explanation may be a conscious designer, as with a pocket watch. The explanation may be a very special kind of process, natural selection. But natural selection, it does imbue functionality. Now, the question of whether you can use purpose is one that philosophers are divided on. Dan Dennett says yes. Dan agrees with me on this point. You can say animals have a purpose that was imbued by natural selection. I don't know if Dan does, but if Dawkins does, but if you read the piece that I linked to from the Times piece, I'm very clear about all this, and I say, now some people are comfortable with the word purpose, some people aren't. So for the benefit of all, I'll use the word purpose in quotes, meaning designed in quotes either by an intelligent being or by some process like natural selection. But in any event, there's an imbuing of functionality, and whether you want to call it purpose is up to you. Okay, so if natural selection was set in motion by a kind of a meta-natural selection process, such as one I described in the Times piece, I think in that event, those of us who use the word purpose broadly, we say that's a purpose. Those of us who wouldn't. But I'm clear about all that, and that's now those by the way have very different kind of theological consequences. It may not.
Yeah, I mean the average believer is not going to use the word purpose in that way. Functional design of a wing. The purpose of an eye is to see. The purpose of a wing is to fly. Right. That's not what most people.
Well, it's not what religious people mean by it, but it's actually a pretty common sense. I think a lot of people would accept it as a useful way to talk about organic life and the functions of organic life. Yeah, the purpose of my eyes is to see. A lot of people would say that casually, but I think at the same time, if you say what they wouldn't do probably is get the kind of religious consolation out of hearing that natural selection was imbued with a kind of a purpose of creating intelligent life only in that sense, right? If that was only imbued by some blind process, they're not going to find that so theologically consoling. Fine, I'm not making in that sense a religious argument. I'm just trying to get to the first point of Dawkins's like decision branching diagram. Like, is natural selection a process that, when you look at it and the way it's unfolded, you might logically say, yeah, maybe that requires a special explanation in one sense or another. Like. If that makes sense.
Again, okay, just a couple things. One, back to the Jerry Coyne, Richard Dawkins response to your arguments.
I don't think Dawkins has ever responded, but anyway.
Okay. But the average person reads Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life, and that's what they think of as purpose. My purpose here is God put me here so I could love Jesus and whatever. And that's not at all what we're talking about. So it's unfortunate that we're using the same word.
Well, although let me be clear, it could be. I mean, if we knew for sure that natural selection fell in that Dawkins category requires a special explanation, then we wouldn't know. Was it set in motion by some deistic God, or was it set in motion by meta-naturalism? We just wouldn't know. But I want to be clear, I'm not ruling out that possibility either.
Okay, all right. And then the other thing, I think it's good to remember, just to remind everybody, when we're talking about natural selection, it's often used or reified as like it's a force of nature, like gravity or electromagnetism or something. And it's good to remember it's not. It's just a description of something that happens in nature. Much like I mentioned punctuated equilibrium, people glommed onto that like it was some special force of nature. And all it was Gould's and Eldridge's description of the fossil record, which has long periods of stasis and then short bursts of rapid speciation. So it isn't doing, natural selection isn't doing anything. And I think it was one of the unfortunate analogies of Charles Darwin's book to open with artificial selection as a kind of a metaphor, because we know
by which he means domestication of like animals, the way farmers do it.
Right. We know that that's really not. It's hard to pick the right metaphor for describing things in nature, and that was a good one in his time, and maybe it's still a good one, but it implies that there is a selector, like there's some force selecting for, rabbit's ears or pigeon's wings or whatever, and there's no such force at all. It's not at all like an artificial selection, a breeder. It's not like a breeder at all. Right. It's just describing differential reproductive success and nothing more. Just some, just population genetic shifts over time and so on. It's just a description, so it's not a force. So in terms of like the word purpose, again, we tend to reify that into, well, there's something out there that's reaching in to stir the particles in a certain direction. Right. And you're not talking about that, are you?
No, I'm not. But let me acknowledge that the way I set my piece up, I can kind of see how maybe I should have done more emphatic disclaimers to clarify what you just said, to dispel the misreading, because I started it out, I had this great footage of William Hamilton. I don't know if did you watch the video?
Yeah, of course.
William Hamilton, one of the great biologists of the 20th century.
Yes,
I had this video footage that had never seen the light of day, but I taped it like 24 years ago. And you know who I taped it with is Alex Gibney, who's now a famous documentarian.
Right, very good.
But we never got it made into a documentary.
That's too bad. You should still do that.
Well, we've got the footage, and I want to do something with it. But because I got Hamilton to talk about everything, his childhood kin selection, which he's famous for coming up with, and so on. But anyway, there's this one moment where, to my surprise, he goes off on how he thinks, he says, I don't think we can dismiss this scenario that evolution was set up by, like, space aliens, and every once in a while they intervene, and these are the miracles that religious people talk about. Well, the reason, and I was reasonably clear about this. I mean, I did talk about how even if he's right and the aliens intervene, that's still a naturalistic process because they would just be physical beings. But I said more to the point, and this was my main point, is that the reason Hamilton started thinking that maybe aliens set it up is because he believed evolution was in fact likely to lead to an intelligent species. So I was trying to establish that in a totally credible evolutionary biologist, A, you could believe evolution was likely to create intelligence, and B, that same biologist thought this logically leads to questions of purpose. That was my point, but I can certainly see that Coyne got totally off on the aliens thing and kind of wrote it as if like my whole column was an argument that there are space aliens. And at the end I specifically said I'm not associating myself with that part of the argument, Well,
but I don't have any problems with that because I think it's that's panspermia. That's
right, exactly. Francis Crick.
Either accidentally or even if it was intentionally. But it doesn't really help us answer the question: how did it get started in the first place from the bottom up? That's still a kind of Crane argument, a kind of skyhook argument. We still need the Crane argument for where the aliens, how they became complex beings. What self-replicating molecules on their planet, how did that start?
Well, sure, but you go as far as you can. I mean, this is a common reaction I get, and the reason I get it, I know, is because you're used to people arguing for God, for the existence of God as the prime mover. I'm not saying that whatever set natural selection in motion, if something did, was the prime mover. So an analogy I'd use is like if back when Dawkins first proposed the theory of natural selection, okay.
Darwin, yeah.
Darwin, did I say Dawkins?
Yeah.
Okay. Easy to get them mixed up.
Yes.
Both British, smart, and Darwinian. Right. If when Darwin first did that, said, wait, I've got the explanation for how animals came into existence. It's this process called natural selection. You wouldn't have said, wait, that's worthless because you can't tell us where natural selection came from, right? You wouldn't have said, wait, but that's not the prime mover. Well, he's not trying to give us the prime mover. He's trying to take the explanation one step further, right? Right. So I get that.
But again, and natural selection is not even the right thing we should be looking for. It's the self-replicating molecules that start. You got to somehow kickstart these random molecules just bouncing around in a Brownian motion type thing into something more directional, which is what you're after with purpose. So it's moving in some direction. From the left wall of simplicity, it can only go further right. So it has to go, to start, it has to become more complex. The question
there are other reasons that it is likely to. I think Gould's account was incomplete in suggesting that's the only reason things become more complex, but fine, whatever.
Yeah, of course. No, I agree. Yeah, there could be particularly good reasons for that. So if you want to talk about design, function, purpose, I think we're on the same page. We just have to pick our words because we have to use language and agree this is what we mean by them. And then from there, then the question is there directionality in that sense? And let's just take into consciousness or intelligence, since that's what you've written a lot about. And back to my example of sharks, they've been around 400 million years, pretty much the same that they've always been. And that's true for most species, genus, lineages, whatever level you want to talk about. There isn't a lot of directionality once you get to after the Precambrian explosion, and then the diversity of life, say 200 million years ago. Pretty much there's not a lot of directionality after that in terms of more complex. The one peculiar thing we're all interested in, because it's us, is our own consciousness, and that holds a special place. But if you take us out of it for a minute and just ask if there's something special about brains, big brains, and you agree on the epiphenomenal explanation for consciousness. It's just you just have to have so many neurons to get there, which means you need bigger and more complex brains. For most organisms, there's just nothing special about it. Brains are too expensive to run. It's probably better to not have big brains and consciousness. It's probably to better be a zombie because you're more efficient and simpler in terms of investing your energy into getting resources for survival and reproduction that doesn't require a big brain. So other than us, I don't see the directionality.
Yeah, but we're the important thing, I think, in a sense that I'll now try to elaborate on. And one thing this gives me is a chance to elaborate on what I meant when about how I can see the relationship between directionality and purpose. So to go back to Dawkins's book, arguing that, yes, animals demand a special kind of explanation in life generally, but if you ask, well, what are the things about an animal that would make you suspect that they were in some sense designed, either designed in quotes by natural selection or, whatever, but designed things, first of all, it's the manifest functionality of an adult organism, these complex organs that seem unlikely to have arisen just by chance alone. But also, if you look at the unfolding, the embryogenesis, the ontogeny, I guess. There's a kind of directionality to the unfolding. It's like it goes to higher. It starts as an egg. It carries organization to higher and higher levels, and it creates functionality at those larger levels. Now, my argument is, if you look at the direction of life on Earth, it's actually not just that. And ask, is there a parallel between that and the unfolding of an organism? It's not just that I'm arguing it was likely to lead to something intelligent. It's like, well, the intelligent species it's in fact led to is now constructing what looks for all the world like a giant, superorganism with a giant global brain, the internet, right? So I'm arguing if you stepped back, you would have reason to say, wait, was the point of this to create some kind of giant global superorganism? And if that's the question, then the relevant question isn't, do species in general get more complex? The question is, as time goes by, does the level of intelligence and complexity of the most complex and intelligent species get higher? And more to the point, was the process likely to eventually produce one species smart enough to build the giant global brain, right? Smart enough to set cultural and technological evolution in motion that then leads to this thing. So I think analytically, the key question, it's not about some general tendency toward complexity per se. It's about the outer envelope of complexity. The most complex and intelligent species. Was that envelope likely to reach the level we're at? And you can argue both ways. I'm not saying it's an open and shut case, but just to be clear, that's where I think the argument needs to be.
Yeah. Okay, so two things. One on the embryological development. So in a different context entirely, in a debate I was doing with Rupert Murdoch, who, I'm not Rupert Murdoch, Rupert Sheldrake.
I'd love to have a different debate with Rupert
That would be a different debate.
So Rupert Sheldrake, unlike Rupert Murdoch, has this theory of morphic resonance, right? Which always seemed a little dubious to me, although I never really read up on it. But it sounds...
Well, his example of embryology, how does an arm know, in the womb as it's developing, how does it know to become, the 5 fingers and the ulnar and radius and, the tetrapod forelimb, basically? How does it know to become that? As the cells are developing, how do they know I'm supposed to be the pinky finger bone and the middle finger bone and that sort of thing? So his hypothesis, he claims embryologists have no idea how this happens, and therefore there's some kind of field that guides the cells, an outer field, almost like it'd be its own force, essentially. He doesn't think I don't think he would call it supernatural. It's a part of nature's forces we don't yet understand. But when I talk to embryologists about that, they go, no, we actually do understand that. They're chemical signals directing the cells to develop muscles and tissues and bone and so forth. And that now has a bottom-up crane mechanical explanation that begins with the fertilization of the cell and the cells start dividing. All that's purely chemical. And it would be the result of the first self-replicating molecule going all the way back, and also the embryo is it's becoming what it's destined to become based on its genome, but it's not going anywhere beyond that. Once it gets to the level of fish or chicken or human, whatever, it's done. And then it starts dying after we're born and so on. So there's that. And then on the other question, back when I read and reviewed Nonzero, I remember thinking about, is there anything special about Neanderthals? Because I think you made the argument it wasn't us, it would have been Neanderthals, not Neanderthals, it might have been Homo erectus, all the way back to chimpanzees and so on. And at the time, when I looked that up, the paleoanthropologists were saying there was no trend in, say, European Neanderthal toolkits. They weren't becoming more complex over a couple 100,000 years when they were alone in Europe. Mm-hmm. They weren't developing art. They weren't developing signs of complex culture as they were inevitably unfolding along some more intelligent pathway. They weren't doing anything. They were just doing exactly what species do, just surviving and reproducing in their environment. And we now know since then that there's probably at some point, there were at least a dozen bipedal primates living simultaneously around the world. And we're the last one standing. Not clear why that is, but it probably has nothing to do with some drive toward intelligence, but just the luck of the draw of a bottleneck. Apparently our species was a bottleneck of under 1,000 individuals, and had a storm swept through or some catastrophe, gone. I don't think we'd have a super global brain. I don't think.
Well, we might not, but I want to emphasize that. One thing I was doing in making that argument that it might have been the Neanderthals, and by the way, we now know that we actually had sex with the Neanderthals, so they didn't entirely drop out of the picture. We have some of their genes with us, but I was making that in the context of Gould. Gould had written a whole book. I think what was the name of that? It was about the Burgess Shale. That was in the subtitle, but. I gave Gould what I think was his first negative book review. It was just a total shock for him. But when that book came out, I did a review in the New Republic arguing that he was kind of missing the point, because that book was almost entirely devoted to showing that the human species had not been an inevitable or even likely outcome of evolution. And I just made the point, nobody is saying it is. That's not the question. The question is, was some intelligent species likely to evolve eventually? So it's a question about the likelihood of the evolution of certain properties.
Wonderful Life, that was it.
That was it, Wonderful Life. And so, I mean, these are obviously gets pretty conjectural when you're starting to talk about, doing these counterfactuals about what if we had been wiped out. I would say that more than one species has gotten pretty darn smart. And the other thing I'd say is that the evolution back then, even our own evolution of toolkits, was just glacially slow. And one thing I tried to show in Nonzero is why it gets faster and faster and faster, over time. But you wouldn't expect to see a lot of these are.
Because I don't think you see that in Homo erectus or Neanderthals. I don't think you see any, not even glacially slow progress. Just really, once you got the most basic stone tools, that's it. They don't change at all. Maybe I'm wrong about that in the last few years, but as far as I know,
think even in our lineage, and I don't know the exact dates we're talking about, but I think there are times when you see like a new innovation, every million years or something, right? I mean, but anyway, let me emphasize, I could be totally wrong about that. That doesn't bother me. If somebody wants to argue that point with me, because then they at least understand what I'm arguing. What really gets on my nerves is to have to wade through a whole Jerry Coyne piece that just consists of nothing but like red herrings and misunderstandings and misstatements of what I've actually said. And by the way, I mean, what he said in fairness, when I challenged him to debate me on video, he said, well, I'd rather you reply in writing, and I think written replies are more instructive. I said, look, I don't have time every time someone misunderstands me to spend a day writing an essay, but a link we will provide that I would encourage people to read is my response to the review of The Evolution of God, my book, The Evolution of God, he did for the New Republic, which was a hit job. I mean, I won't go into it, but the literary editor, Leon Wieseltier, is not exactly a close friend of mine, let's just say. And I encourage people to read the misrepresentations of my book that I think are kind of beyond doubt that I lay out there. And I also want to emphasize, I don't think it's conscious misrepresentation. I don't think he's intellectually dishonest in that sense. I just think he has the tribal psychology you alluded to, which we all have to some extent. And in fact, I noticed it when I went through his piece, because I'd go through his piece and find the most outrageous thing and see, okay, here's where he misrepresented me. And then on second reading, I'd go, well, it's not as bad as I thought. I wanted to yank it out of context. It's still in the aggregate pretty bad, I contend, but I want to emphasize we all do this.
I don't know. I don't know Jerry that well. I know that he's more into writing than doing public debates. So maybe that, some people, that's just their thing, or it's not their thing, whatever. So I don't know. But just along those same lines, like Steve Pinker this morning tweeted something about David Sloan Wilson's, he wrote some piece about, is there a God? Yes. And the God is a superorganism, because he's into group selection. Right. And the superorganism, like a hive of bees, that's like a God. And Steve's little tweet was like, oh, come on. This is just getting out of hand. It's like everybody's jumping on yes, that there is a God and I can prove it. And it's this natural thing over here that no theist or Christian would ever look at and go, oh, boy, there's science finally proved the God I believe in, because, of course, they're not making that argument at all. So maybe they're just lumping you in with those kinds of. Yeah.
You actually alerted to me. I mean, that's maybe an interesting thing to talk about. I've maybe spent enough time vociferously defending myself. But you had sent me the piece that Jerry Coyne wrote about David Sloan Wilson's piece. Now, I didn't really read either of them. I didn't read David's piece at all. But did you read them? I mean, I've never before thought of David as arguing that there's a God in any meaningful sense. I think of it.
He doesn't. Yeah. Yeah. It's just, I don't know. This is just a thing that gets banded around in social media and then all of a sudden becomes a thing. So I don't know. I think the topic is super interesting from a scientific perspective. I love the piece you did, the little video clip with Dan Dennett as well. That's where people should watch that. He's a very cautious, careful linguist in terms of using words in a certain way that he wants to make sure everybody understands what he means by that word. And that's really the only hope we have of communicating clearly, is if we define our words. So when you use that word purpose, again, in one of my tweets to you, he's like, well, what do you mean by higher? I mean, the ultimate purpose of life, you have proximate versus ultimate explanations. The proximate explanation for why things taste sweet is because we have taste buds that respond to molecules in fruit and sugar, whatever, that sends a signal to a part of your brain. Okay, but why would it taste sweet in the first place? Well, the evolutionary explanation, because sweet things in a natural environment like fruit are at once rare and nutritious, so there's a natural selection for us to favor those, and so they would taste good, something like that. But you can even take it one step further. I mentioned this, maybe I didn't mention to you, but there's a good article by Tooby and Cosmides, Lita Cosmides and John Tooby, and another guy named Hawk, that is called the second law of thermodynamics is the first law of human psychology, or just psychology. So, and their argument is the law
that says that entropy grows inexorably in the universe. The second law,
right?
Disorder,
right?
Yeah.
Right, disorder. So I'll just read you that little clip of it. Let's see. So, the purpose of life is to survive, reproduce, and flourish in the teeth of the entropy and it has been fulfilling its destiny for 3.5 billion years. That's my argument. So here's a quote from Tooby and Cosmides. The most basic lesson is that natural selection is the only known natural process that pushes populations of organisms thermodynamically uphill into higher degrees of functional order, or even offset the inevitable increase in disorder that would otherwise take place. So the second law of thermodynamics is the first law of psychology. So that would be taking it back even one, ultimate explanation. Why are there laws of nature? I mean, I guess, why is there a universe? That would be the ultimate question. But once you have a universe, that has entropy, then the only way for organisms to survive and flourish is they have to push uphill against the gradient of entropy. So everything organisms do is going to be going against that. And so the things to explain are not why do organisms die. They die because that's what entropy does. Why do they live? How do they live as long as they do? Those are the harder questions.
Right. If you've got the self-replicating thing in the first place, and the ones that are best at doing it are going to survive, then you wind up getting the repeated construction of these local pockets of disentropy, not just order, but complexity, which complexity consists of pockets of order, but it's a totally amazing fact.
If you mean by purpose, if you mean that by purpose, then that's a purpose-driven life in a way, if I can use that phrase. Its purpose is to push against entropy.
I don't mean that by purpose, but I mean, why don't we talk a little more about purpose and higher purpose in particular? Now, by the way, it turns out that I think what Jerry Coyne and I actually agree on, to the extent that he calls attention to a substantive disagreement, it's that he wants to define purpose differently. He says if you want to, he says if you want to define purpose one way, I won't get into that. He says that's fine, but that notion undercuts what every human thinks about what's purposeful, which is that it reflects processes driven by a being with foresight. Well, again, he's wrong about that because Dan Dennett does not use the term that way. But if he wants to use the term that way, where purpose has to, where for evolution to have a purpose, there'd have to be some conscious being like guiding it or driving it. Well, then we just disagree there on terminology, and he could have, we could save a lot of trouble. That's a different. I'm not using the term the way I'd call that a subset of purpose in my sense of the term. And I think I've already talked a little about kind of in the context of the Dawkins Blind Watchmaker book about the two, kind of what I mean. But as for the term higher purpose in particular, that's an interesting phrase. I mean, what I said in the New York Times piece is, by higher purpose, the idea that there's some point to life on Earth that emanates from something that is in some sense beyond it. Okay? So it could be meta-natural selection, something we kind of can't see in some sense. Doesn't mean it's in transcendent space, not in the material world. It just means that it's not obvious to us. It could be the thing that started natural selection. It could be Hamilton's alien scenario, both in the sense that they started life and in the sense that they intervened. Who knows? But in any event, it would be purpose imparted by something that's not immediately evident to us.
Well, that could just be the laws of nature, such that any organisms on any planet would very likely be there because of natural selection or something like that, self-replicating molecules of some kind. And therefore, they would also have to push against the gradient of entropy. They would also have to develop complex systems to push against entropy and figure out a way to reproduce and so on, or else we wouldn't find them. They wouldn't be there. And if that's a higher purpose, then okay.
No, I wouldn't say that's a higher purpose. I mean, what I would say about that is then on all those planets, individual lives would have been imbued with purpose in the sense, at least, of replicating their genes, in the sense that that's what they are, quote, designed to do. So that would be their goal, their function,
right.
And that's what Dan Dennett would say. But that's not what I wouldn't call that a higher purpose.
Well, it's still transcendent of you and me, personally, individually. It's not just something special to me, it's beyond me.
Right, it emanates from natural selection, something larger than us. And my question is, does natural selection have something like that? Something that started natural selection that is larger than natural selection, that imbued natural selection with a purpose.
I see. And by that you mean the self-replicating molecules that have random genetic variation and non-random cumulative selection, that process.
Yeah, so I mean,
again, I don't like to. I fear reifying that word, that phrase, natural selection. It's like gravity or electromagnetism. Mm-hmm. It's not like that. It's just a description of these things that are happening in a biological system,
right?
A chemical biological system. And nothing more than that.
It's something that has to happen in a certain sense once you have self-replication amid, kind of, you might say, scarce resources.
I think so, and I think that's why the search for extraterrestrial life of any kind, forget intelligence, just bacterial grade life, would be spectacular, because it would show that at least in another place that process happens naturally.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also wanted to talk about moral progress, right, which you're very interested in, and I think is relevant because, to me, if you ask, I mean, if there's some purpose beyond us that's unfolding, like there is in some sense in which the system is, quote, designed to lead to a giant global brain, that would call for a cohesion of global social organization that I think can only be reached if we make more moral progress. So,
yes.
The questions I'm raising, in fact, almost the main reason I'm interested in them is because of their connection to moral progress. That's certainly one big reason.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's not unrelated, but I know you're interested that your last book was about that, partly. And does it figure in your next book as well?
Just a little bit in the discussion of progress and where things are going, and finding meaning of life in contemplating death. I think I debunked this whole idea of I forget what it's called now. The terror, the terror. What is it? Terror about death theory.
That drives me nuts. What is the term for it, though?
A terror management theory.
Terror management theory.
Yeah, that everything we do, building skyscrapers, painting the Mona Lisa, designing art, is all done because we're terrorized by the prospect of our immortality, and therefore it's a pushback against. I just think they've ignored evolution entirely in terms of
right.
of just sexual selection and other reasons.
It's a profoundly un-Darwinian explanation. Now, people, if they want to hear the case for it, there was a dialogue done on Blogging Heads by my friend John Horgan and a professor who is a big proponent of that, and they can search for terror management on Blogging Heads and they'll find it. But it's just like, why would that be the case? Why would animal? It just doesn't. There are so many alternative reasons for why we do all the things that it purports to explain.
Right, and we do them for different reasons. Anyway, just to get back to your question, on some days I tend to push toward your argument that the non-zero exchanges are slightly outcompeting the zero sum exchanges throughout history, because it does kind of look like that. And if you look at each moral revolution over the last couple of centuries, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of torture, the granting of rights to vote to blacks and then women, all the way up to same-sex marriage, there's always the forces that want it against the forces that don't, and they're kind of competing. And at every stage, the expansion of the moral sphere has just kind of barely nudged into the surrounding space just a little bit. And it's been glacially slow until just recently. And it could be your superorganism brain is what's in part pushing it a little bit faster. Like same-sex marriage came about much faster than, say, the civil rights movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. That took much longer, or faster than the women's rights movement. And it could be just the more rapid communication, but it really takes us to sort of boots on the ground. What actually happened that particular day to cause this event that led to the changing of the law in that particular state that then got challenged and went to the Supreme Court? Mm-hmm. You have to kind of look at to see what that happens. And there, I do think it's like, maybe things are accelerating a little bit because just communication happens faster. Revolutions can organize quicker through, through the internet and so on. There may be something there.
Yeah, there may be. I mean, I think certainly you can understand why technological change is moving faster and faster. And certainly in some cases, I think technological change, well, it works both ways. I think sometimes it drives people toward moral progress, and sometimes it exacerbates tribal divisions that lead to what you might call moral regression. Right. But it's certainly changing the stakes. I mean, one thing I just thought of is that, I mentioned one definition of higher purpose that I threw out, but I'd also be willing to think about higher purpose as meaning a morally higher purpose. And that's not unrelated to what I'm talking about. I mean, if the structural purpose involves a cohesive global community, and who knows what lies beyond that, maybe then we replicate and spread life to other planets, who knows, but But if it involves that, and that involves moral progress, then part of this larger purpose would be a moral purpose that is higher than the Darwinian purpose we know of. I mean, the Darwinian purpose we know of is just to get our genes spread. However, that's the only thing we're designed to do. And if that happens to coincide with morally good behavior, fine, but often it doesn't. So if there's something about this hypothesized larger purpose that involves a kind of moral calling to a higher level of moral evolution, I think you could say that the purpose is higher in that sense as well. If you wanted to, it's a different way to talk.
That's right. It's a way to talk. I would agree with that. I'm thinking of Paul Bloom's new book that just came out this week, Against Empathy. So here's a good example. We tend to think of empathy as just a positive moral value that we all hold. Yeah. And he shows that, in fact, it cuts both ways. Sometimes empathy is good, sometimes it's not. In ways that it's not, it makes us more tribal. We're more empathetic to our fellow members within our tribe, but that makes you more susceptible to xenophobia to people in other tribes that are different from us. And so in that case, it's not good to be super empathetic. You want more of a rational argument to override your empathetic emotions. So Paul, like me and Steve Pinker, are arguing for reason has to take triumph over moral emotions. The moral emotions sort of push things along, but you got to guide them. There's got to be a steering wheel there of reason that directs it. Peter Singer's arguments along those lines. And so there, if there's a higher purpose and a direction to moral progress, we're driving it. We're the drivers.
We're the drivers in a sense in any event. But, the question, if you wanted to connect to a larger purpose, would be, was the system set up such that, set up in quotes, whether it's by a being or whatever, we've been through all that, or a process or whatever, such that, not that the moral progress is inevitable, but it's the only alternative to our own, destruction or our own dissolving into chaos or whatever. In other words, was the incentive structure, in a certain sense, set up to kind of draw us toward moral progress, even though it's far from inevitable that we'll succeed, right?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. And we can, again, break it down to boots on the ground. Let's talk about specifics. We know that free trade between countries reduces the likelihood that they'll have conflict. Not inevitable. Sometimes two countries with McDonald's do go to war, but generally they don't. and so, but in terms of one company wanting to trade with another company or whatever, they just want to make a profit. It's like natural slave. They just want to get their genes in the next generation. They just want to get their profits into the next quarter. And so it does take somebody higher up to go, well, actually, you see, like an economist or the director of finances or, whoever, to say, actually, this is good for our country. This is Adam Smith's argument. The wealth of a nation actually grows as a result of allowing us to trade with foreign companies. And all of us get richer in the process. Seems counterintuitive. It seems like we're tribal and that they're the bad people and we're the good people. But in fact, we'll all get richer. And that takes a higher order argument to override, your emotions that say, no, I think we should just hoard as many of our resources as we can and put tariffs on those evil foreign goods. Right. And so is there something inevitable? I don't know, other than it seems like we are making more and more of those kinds of rational arguments against that natural impulse to, close up the borders, get rid of the trade agreements because, we have to save American jobs and so on. Those are very ancient, sort of moral emotions that we've been struggling against. And I'm not sure it's inevitable, but it is a force that we've been fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, it's an awkward time in our political history for you to profess optimism about some of those things. And I would say, look, as a practical matter, a country has to, as we move to a global level of social organization, we have to make sure that there are not large numbers of people who feel that they're getting a raw deal and are left out and are in fact being left out. And there's no doubt that some people in the short term do suffer from free trade or do suffer from immigration because they're competing with immigrants for jobs. And I think we have to be mindful of that. At the same time, in the long run, I just don't think nationalism can be the thing that prevails. I just think we'll all go down in flames if we do not manage the impetus that technology is imparting toward a higher level of political and social organization.
I agree. At the end of the moral arc, I speculated on the demise, ultimate demise of the nation state. The nation state's only been around for a few centuries. Before that, there were, I don't know, something like 5,000 political units in Europe alone in 1500. All these tiny little counties and duchies and so forth that got all coalesced in the 17th and 18th centuries into these giant nation states. That may go all the way back to city states in centuries to come. This is what someone like Stuart Brand argues. That the action is all in the cities. I think we're either close to or now more than 50% of the Earth's population lives in cities for the first time, and that's only going to get more and more. By 2100, it's going to be like 80% of the world's population lives in cities. So cities is where the power is. Cities is where the action is. So that may be one trend that we're not really orchestrating from the top down. It's just happening naturally, just depending where people want to live, such that the nation state will just fall into disuse. Those borders will become porous, and so on. That's another trend that, to me feels like a higher purpose.
We're being driven toward a situation now. I don't think national borders are going to dissolve anytime soon, and in fact, I think it's a very delicate process to manage, and we're going to have to reckon with nationalist impulses for some time, and they're not necessarily bad. There's such a thing as benign patriotism, but I do think I think it's a very delicate process, and I do think we're being driven there. There's no nations. Their sovereignty is being eroded by technology. It's not like they can choose not to surrender their sovereignty. The question is, do they want to reclaim some degree of self-control by the way they manage their international relations, which I think sometimes includes global governance and so on. But I think we're kind of on the same page. Let me reiterate, affirm what you said about Paul Bloom's book Against Empathy. It's a great book, because it does point out that although we have these moral impulses, empathy, and so on, natural selection did not design us to deploy them in morally optimal fashion. And if we want to do that, it's going to take reflection. But I also want to emphasize that I think, you mentioned some people who are on that boat, Paul and Steve Pinker and some other people. I'm not sure that all of these people always see the problem the way I do, because I think there's, you said they think reason is going to have to prevail. I agree. I think some of them mean by reason we're going to have to stomp out religion, as if that's the only problem. And I think it's often not the problem, and I think religion has done some good things. We could have that argument, but my main point is that I think the problem is more generic. It's the psychology of tribalism, and that some of the people who want to squash religion, some of the new atheists, evince a psychology of tribalism that to me is as pronounced and as blinding as some religious fundamentalists, for reasons I've already said. And I too evince it sometimes. I totally admit, but I think it requires a degree of self-consciousness and self-awareness, and in some cases what you might call a spiritual discipline, like maybe something like mindfulness meditation, which I think can be very productive in this context. But and it's just not about whether you're religious. That's what's that is what I think is the big fallacy. That, gosh, if we can get rid of religion, then we can just all sing John Lennon's Imagine.
Right. Yeah, had we been having this dialogue in the late 70s, we'd be talking about the problem of revolutionary Marxism and why it's led to all these violent terrorism attacks and attempts to overthrow governments and states and so on. And we wouldn't even be discussing religion, because that wasn't a motivating factor for that form of terrorism. So these things do change. It's good to take a bigger perspective. I do think that currently, first general, human behavior is multi-causal, multi-motivational. People do things for many reasons, not just one. Religion, clearly, for Islamic terrorists, is a huge motivating factor. Not the only one. And also, which terrorists are we talking about? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote a nice piece in Time magazine last year saying that the whole Islamism thing, that's just being spouted by the leaders to convince and brainwash the boots on the ground to go blow themselves up, but they don't really believe it. They have political motives. They're just brainwashing the followers to believe this stuff. And I mean, who knows what's in people's hearts? Clearly, religion has some role. Some of these guys do it for the sex, the money, the adventure. Some of them do it for political, economic reasons or jobs, or others do it for religious reasons. They really think they're going to get to the afterlife. So I don't think it's fair to say it's all one or the other, no matter which form of terrorism we're talking about. But I do think with Islamism in particular, the religious belief in the afterlife is certainly a motivating factor.
Oh, I think there's no doubt that if you don't believe in the afterlife, you're way less likely to be a suicide bomber. So that's a specific example of something.
Although clearly not for revolutionary Marxists, who were atheists. They had a different. They were willing to blow themselves up.
But how many of them blew themselves up?
Not many. No,
I mean, what I would say, I think there's religion. I think a lot of them are sincere believers. At the same time, I mean, first of all, I think that per se, if you want to wipe that out, good luck. I mean, that's just a very hard thing to change, because it tends to be the case that if you go to these people and try to talk them out of it, it only intensifies their belief. But it also, I think, can kind of take your mind off the question of, well, what other variables can we change that make religious people less likely to be extreme? To what extent does invading countries play a role? To what extent does occupying countries play a role? And things like that. And or drone strikes. I mean, there's a whole range of things that I think need to be discussed. Or surveillance, domestic surveillance that's perceived to be oppressive. I mean, these are all questions we need to discuss. And I think
there's a good article in the issue of Dabiq last February, the ISIS or Daesh publication, their magazine, and it's called "Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You." And it's an anonymous author, and I can't say that I know for sure this person speaks for all of ISIS, but the 6 reasons, the first 4 were purely religious. It was all, you don't believe in Islam and our God and Muhammad and so forth, and by you guys they don't just mean you and I, non-believers, non-Christians, but they meant Jews, Christians, anybody who's not Islamic. And then it just went down the line from there. And then the last 2 were just drone strikes and troops in our holy land and so on, support of Israel. Those are all pretty much purely political. But then he says, but even if you took out your troops and stopped the drone strikes and so on, we would still hate you and still fight you, because religion is our main motivating factor, our belief and the way we think life should go. So you and I share a kind of a liberal, classical liberal attitude about, liberal democracies and spread of free trade, globally. The global superorganism, I imagine it being something like every country is a liberal democracy, everyone has a franchise, anyone can trade with anyone else, minimal tariffs and so on, and just sort of grease the wheels of open exchange between people with ideas and trade and so on. But what do you do with a country that says we don't want to participate in that? That's not what we believe. Our fundamental moral values are that it's a closed society. We don't want to interact with Westerners. We don't believe in the kinds of clothes you wear. This is our beliefs. Leave us alone. And what do you do with that?
I think you leave them to their own devices. You can't compel them. I think eventually they'll sign up for the project sooner or later. And I should say, I don't think we have exactly the same ideas about what the project is. I'm probably to the left of you. I would think trade agreements should have labor and environmental accords that you might and might not think. But I think we're on the same page, and that we think that globalization is something that's going to move forward, or else worse things are going to happen. I mean, I think. But as for the question about this one guy claiming religion, it's all about religion. Well. Yeah, that's what I would. I would emphasize that probably if I were a jihadist propagandist. But at the same time, I don't think, even if he believes it, I don't think people always understand what their actual motivations are. I don't think people always understand what it is that actually incited them so much that they joined some movement. And I think patterns you see if you look at homegrown terrorists are they tend to be alienated. Not that that's an easy problem to solve. But they tend to be people who are not fitting in, and B, they tend to list prominent on their grievances their perception that America is at war with Islam, and that seems to be a thing. But we needn't, we needn't argue. It's politics so much, but
or if you go back to like Timothy McVeigh and the whole '90s militia movement, that wasn't religiously motivated. That was, and I'm not sure how political it was. It was certainly this fear that the encroaching big government on our rights and freedoms, not just the Second Amendment, but all of the rights in the Constitution. They were rallying against the threat against that. That wasn't really religion either. That was more political.
Right. And McVeigh himself, like so many of these people, somebody things hadn't quite worked out for. He had wanted to be, I think, in the Special Forces or something, but the Army had given him the brush off. And, his life wasn't going that well. Not that that's an easy problem to solve, but it's a material problem that drives people toward this. But in
terms of ultimate purpose, I think what you're talking about that I would like to believe is true, but I'm not sure, is the inevitability component.
I don't believe it. I do not know. I swear.
Oh,
I disclaim. I disclaim. The interesting thing to me about this moment in history is that success is far from assured, and that I think success is going to require moral progress.
That we make happen, not that just happens automatically.
Yeah. It's in a certain sense. I mean, in a certain sense, our choice, depending on how you come out on the free will question, I guess will determine, so to speak, how literally you mean choice. But
I mean choice. I'm a compatibilist. Yeah. I think we do. I think our choices are part of the causal net of the universe, but there are our choices, and we can make them, really make them, and make a difference.
Can I ask for your advice? So I'm trying to. I've been working with some people to try to help things along in this very way. Help people understand the psychology of tribalism that afflicts us all to some extent. And, whether you want to look at the last election in the United States, where I think it afflicted both sides to some extent, you can argue about where it was worst, or sectarian conflict in the Middle East, or new atheists versus me, or whatever, where on both sides you see some of this. But I think the gravest examples are, ideological conflict, sectarian conflict, national conflict, and of particular interest, you might say a conflict between kind of cosmopolitans and nationalists, right? And I think even there, the psychology of tribalism to some extent exists on both sides. So I'm just I'd like to get people thinking about this in ways that are productive and don't make the problem worse. And I haven't figured out exactly how to do it. I mean, there are other people I've talked to who are interested in this, in averting the apocalypse, so to speak. But it's a challenge. Do you have any great insight?
I don't know if I do. I think part of the problem is that when these things are played out publicly, like say with you and Jerry doing some sort of written exchange, which you've done, then someone like him is forced to signal to his side of the group, this is how strongly I'm holding the line on naturalism. And anybody that varies from that just a little bit, we got to slap him back.
Although I want to emphasize, I'm not varying from naturalism, but go ahead.
I understand, but obviously the way the words were used led Jerry to say, "Oh, he's gone off the deep end here with purpose." Okay, maybe that's not the right word. Maybe functional design is the right word, although that doesn't sound as good to the average reader. What's the functional design of life? What's the purpose of life is sounds like a grander question. So maybe if you just did it privately, here's what I think, what do you think? And I don't know. And then maybe ultimately publish that or something. But, I just think the direction we're going of more literacy, more spread of knowledge and information through many, many channels, it has been one of the sources of moral progress in the sense, like if you just look at the gay rights movement, they got a lot of steam through television and television shows and scripts and so on, where it just like that Seinfeld episode, it just becomes something funny to laugh about. Gay.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
That's right. Yeah. That was just sort of in the middle of things of the transition. they were sort of both reflecting the way things were going in cities like New York and the way it should go and actually has gone. Like, gay, whatever, dude, I don't care. And now that the Supreme Court has voted the way it is, it'll go the same way as the interracial marriage thing. People will just quit talking about it, and it'll become a non-subject. And then when, like, this movie just came out called Loving about that particular case, interracial marriage that changed the law, that it's like, that was a thing. I mean, people really were against that. Yeah, almost everybody. In 1959, only 4% of Americans agreed with interracial marriage, so that mostly happens from the bottom up. You do have to change laws from the top down, ultimately, to enforce it. But to change people's minds, that happens through cartoons and movie scripts and television shows and books and newspaper articles and just stuff we absorb. And your global brain, I think, is going to make all of that happen faster and more efficiently.
Well, and there's such thing as too fast. I mean, there can be backlash, and and I think a lot of Trump supporters feel that they are being coerced into being what they call politically correct.
Right.
And some of the political correctness you might disapprove of as well, but they feel that elites are imposing it on them.
Oh, absolutely, and it's true. I mean, a number of us have been railing against the whole movement on college campuses of safe spaces and microaggressions. And all of that stuff I wrote about in The Moral Arc in terms of, correcting the way people use language does matter. And so it's good that we shift things a little bit, but the whole PC thing went too far, and that's the response. It's like, hey, enough. You're not my mother. Don't tell me the words I can use and can't use. And then you get to these, gender neutral pronouns and safe spaces, and then people are by this point just rolling their eyes, and they don't want anything to do with it. Again, that would be an example of what you just said. It goes the speed maybe takes it too far.
Yeah. Let me say one final thing about, you were saying with written exchanges that are public, there's a lot of kind of basically showing off, tribal signaling going on. Right. And you're right, it becomes like a showdown and nobody can. One interesting thing we found after we started Blogging Heads like 11 years ago is that 99 times out of 100, if you take two people who have disagreed bitterly in print and put them in a face-to-face conversation, it has a civilizing effect. And I want to emphasize, the irony is that it has to be an unmediated conversation.
Yes,
because like in the standard debate, when there's a mediator, the two people aren't talking to each other.
No,
the moderator says, okay, your turn, and the person addresses the audience. But when two people talk to each other, there tends to be a civilizing effect. Now, let me acknowledge that in one time out of 100, it goes totally off the rails. And it could well be that Jerry Coyne and I would be an example of that, because we have strong feelings, I think, about the way each other does things. But you never know. And usually it works. That's just something I had not expected.
I will encourage Jerry to do exactly what we're doing now. Just talk to you. It can't be that the cross-purpose talk, because the definitions are not clear, can last more than 10 minutes. I mean, once you've said, this is what I mean, Jerry, this is what I mean. Okay, I acknowledge that's what you mean. Now let's talk about the next thing. How long can that go on? In print, that could go on indefinitely, I guess. But so
it can dissolve into screaming. That's happened once on Blogging Heads.
Screaming? Okay.
The famous David Korn, Byron York segment.
Oh, right. I haven't seen that one.
It's excellent.
But in general, this is the argument why more open borders, travel, leads people to have a more openness to experience, to be more liberal in their attitudes, that social attitudes toward other people that are different from them. It's just having some kind of contact with somebody else. It rehumanizes the dehumanization process that they've inculcated from these tribal cultures. So in general, the more of that, the better. I do think, again, your internet global brain is in general a good thing in that regard, and it can only get better. With again a few exceptions here and there.
Okay, well, listen, I think we've covered a whole lot of ground. We've gone longer than usual, but it was really worth it, and I appreciate your you're indulging me in, and I hope I was not too self-absorbed. I mean, you're catching me at a moment, that kind of moment when like you've been kind of trashed online and you're perhaps feeling defensive.
Oh, absolutely. It's good to remember that there's 100 million blogs, so not that many people read any one of them.
On the overwhelming majority of blogs, I was not trashed this week.
That's right.
And no fake news about me emanating from Macedonia either. Okay. Thanks so much, Michael.
All right, Bob.
We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.